You mustn't think I have a closed mind. I have absolutely no objection to your studying telepathy or parapsychology to your heart's content.
Oh, so that's how we ended up with the MBTI. Thanks, Freud, for giving Jung the idea to explore stuff that doesn't mean anything. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Cinema Psych Podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. I am your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and today we've got a bit of a doozy. We're going to go a little down psychology memory lane and talk about the history of psychology in the first of a two-part series of movies that follow events in psychology. Yep, this week and the next episode are going to be two very history of psych-centric movies and topics. So what are we talking about today? A Dangerous Method. A Dangerous Method came out in 2011. Directed by David Cronenberg in his set of films that are set apart from his body horror group of films. So just be aware that this is the heady, intellectual, thriller-ish vibe David Cronenberg. The story was created or written by Christopher Hampton, which is a stage play called The Talking Cure, but that was based on a book in 1993, nonfiction, A Most Dangerous Method by John Kerr. So John Kerr wrote this book in 93. About 10 years later, Christopher Hampton wrote the stage play about the book. Book was nonfiction, by the way. The Talking Cure and A Dangerous Method are both fictionalized stories based on true events, at least that were in the public eye. So A Dangerous Method is essentially stage play on film that you see quite a bit, like Fences or Rent, that kind of thing, where it's very character-driven rather than setting-driven, we'll say. I mean, we're in a certain setting, but, you know, it's character-driven, that kind of thing. So who's in this movie? All the ones you love. I believe the third or so, I mean, maybe the second time out of like 4 different times that Viggo Mortensen has collaborated here with David Cronenberg. So talking, you know, history of violence, that kind of thing. So he plays Freud. Viggo plays Freud. The main character, though, is Jung, Carl Gustav Jung. He is played by Michael Fassbender, using his British accent as opposed to any affectation that he could give to his German roots, because he is of German ancestry. And he speaks German fluently, but he just basically speaks in a more Victorian, post-Victorian industrial era, high British accent, I guess. And then Keira Knightley plays the real Sabina Spielrein, a Russian Jew, and there is an anti-Semitism theme in this movie. Probably won't get to it, but there is a discussion about how Jews and non-Jews, Aryans as they're referred to, have a bit of a clash, have a bit of cultural clash going on. So Spielrein Sabina is played by Keira Knightley, and this is a quick 1 hour and 30-minute movie. Very intellectual. You gotta follow along, otherwise you will miss some things, not everything, but you will miss some things. And if you are a psychology nerd like me, this is one of the movies that maybe you don't come back to, but you definitely see once and maybe discuss in your classes, clips of it. It is not great, but it's not bad either. I would probably give it a 6 or 7 out of 10. And really that's driven by the performances going just full on into these characters, into these real people. So not good, not bad. And so let's talk the history of psychology. My guest host today is Dr. Sheila Thomas. Sheila is a psychologist and researcher specializing in language disorders. She has taught psychology in the UK for the past 25 years and is currently teaching A-level, which is AP for us North Americaners, and the International Baccalaureate, which I think is a little bit more well-known, online from her home in Portugal. Sheila, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alex. It's lovely to have the opportunity to discuss one of my favorite films.
Favorite films. I'm really excited for this then. I'm happy to have you on because we get an international flavor today. I love it. I love it. So before we jump into discussing the movie, as I do with all of my guests, I like to get a sense of the teaching of psychology in your pedagogy. So what are your thoughts on film in general? And then how do you approach films in your teaching of psychology?
That's an interesting question. So I personally use film a lot in my teaching.
Excellent.
In fact, my International Baccalaureate and A-level students were so enthused by the films that we watched in class. They actually asked if we could set up a psychology film club.
Oh, awesome.
As a kind of enrichment activity. So in addition to normal lessons, and during that time, we watched films that dealt with a wider range of psychological issues than those that were just on the syllabus, which was
nice.
Wonderful for extending people's knowledge and experience. And I actually think that images are very powerful aids to remembering things, so that while you might not remember all the notes that you make from a lecture or everything that you read in a book,
right,
you will remember a really powerful image or a moment in a film when you felt really aroused and connected to the events or the characters, and you actually had total focus in that moment. So I think it's invaluable, actually, in the teaching process.
Awesome. That's a great answer. It's probably going to end up in a manuscript or a book I end up writing about all of this kind of stuff. So stay tuned for that. So I love the film club idea. We have a psych social club at my college, and we try to show movies. Licensing fees are just through the roof sometimes when you publicize it and open it to the community members rather than using it under educational fair use, at least in the United States, in a classroom setting. It's so hard to do these kinds of maneuverings with film because of copyright law. But I love the initiative, and I hope it works out for you all, being in different countries, it sounds like.
Absolutely, yeah. We don't really have too many problems with showing films in an educational setting
Right.
in UK schools. That really wasn't an issue. But I personally found it was wonderful preparation for students who were going on to study psychology at university.
Mm-hmm.
So they had plenty of material to talk about in an interview situation or for their personal statement, which they have to write to support their application.
Right.
And also for my, prospective medical students, they were able to broaden their knowledge beyond the actual medical field into more psychological areas. And apparently, that all went down very well when it came to interview.
Awesome.
So it was a really valuable tool, I thought, to just extend people's knowledge. And my students had a real thirst for extra knowledge. And, when it was on top of normal lessons, just watching a film was a really enjoyable activity that also taught you something as well. So it wasn't the same as having another lesson. It was actually a real pleasure. So I think that's where the film idea really came into its own. And as I say, it was hugely popular with my students.
I love that. And the way that you characterized it, the way that you just described it, sometimes I think people don't end up watching movies because it's not a big tentpole action movie or some kind of musical event, some kind of big blockbuster. People don't end up seeing these more independent movies, especially ones that are part of the Venice or Venice Film Festival or Cannes or something like that. And so these artsy intellectual movies, like the one we're about to discuss, kind of gets lost by the wayside. But if you don't have a choice, so to speak, I'm not saying that you're forced to watch it in a classroom, but not having a choice. Like, we're so paralyzed by choice now as well, with all of the streaming services and just the glut of media. Going into a class and saying, hey, we're going to watch this movie. You don't really have a choice. I think you'll enjoy it. And then making that part of the experience, I think, increases most people's enjoyment of the movie. That's what I have found in using film in my classes, that it increases the enjoyment by taking away the choice, the paralysis by choice, and showing them, hey, I've determined this movie meets some quality and content expectations. I think you'll enjoy. I think the average person in this room is going to enjoy it.
Yeah, and sometimes the choices of film actually just sprang organically out of what we were covering within the syllabus.
Yeah, that's awesome too.
So for example, on the International Baccalaureate, one of the papers involves text analysis, and one of the texts that we had one time was on dissociative identity disorder. It was the very famous Eve White and Eve Black case. And from that, we ended up watching The Three Faces of Eve, which is a black and white film. It's incredibly well made. Joanne Woodward won the Oscar for Best Actress for it many years ago.
Right.
And that was a film that the students wouldn't normally have considered watching, but the springboard to that was actually looking at the research paper that was covered in the text.
That's awesome.
And it just sort of happened naturally, which was fantastic.
Okay, so now that we've discussed the film in general, let's pivot to our discussion for today: A Dangerous Method. So you had I put a call out for potential guests onto Twitter, and you found me through there. So I appreciate that. And you had a number of suggestions on I think a website that you had that you showed me, and I realized that I hadn't seen A Dangerous Method. I do recall when it came out about a little more than a decade ago. but I did sleep on it because I was like, nah, it's gonna be a love story between the three of them, and I don't really feel like that. I think the trailer didn't do the actual story justice, because I thought it was just gonna be a boring love drama with real people from the past.
Yeah.
So I slept on it. But I saw that it was on the list, and I was like, you know what? That's one that I want to do. I'm teaching history of psych right now. I think this is a good idea for me. So I reached back out and I said, how about A Dangerous Method? And you said yes. So what brings us here today about Dangerous Method?
Okay, well, as I mentioned earlier, this is really one of my favorite films. And it's mainly because it really enables us to get close to the historical events that happened between two of the most influential psychologists of all time. So, you know, I always reflect on the fact that if we hadn't had someone like Freud and Jung thinking in these really radical new ways,
right,
we would have been stuck forever with, you know, behaviorism and its really simplistic view of human psychology. So, you know, I mean, you can read up on the history of psychology, but I think actually seeing the events portrayed in film really brings to life just how difficult it was to have these groundbreaking original views accepted by the mainstream. I think you see that really clearly in the film. This is not easy to challenge people's accepted view of things, which was fairly basic and fairly simplistic.
I don't think you have any notion of the true strengths and depths of the opposition to our work. There's the whole medical establishment, of course, baying to send Freud to the auto da fe. But that's as nothing compared to what happens when our ideas begin to trickle through in whatever garbled form they're relayed to the public. The denials, the frenzy, the incoherent rage.
But might that not be caused by your insistence on the exclusively sexual interpretation of the clinical material?
All I'm doing is pointing out what experience indicates to me must be the truth. And I can assure you that in 100 years' time, our work will still be rejected. Columbus, you know, had no idea what country he'd discovered. Like him, I'm in the dark. All I know is I've set foot on the shore, and the country exists.
I think of you more as Galileo, and your opponents as those who condemned him, while refusing even to put their eye to his telescope.
In any event, I've simply opened a door. It's for the young men like yourself to walk through it.
I'm sure you have many more doors to open for us.
I mean, Freud himself actually saw himself on a continuum, really, with someone like Charles Darwin, whose views were not readily accepted, were actually attacked and challenged by the establishment. And Freud seems to be very much in that kind of that tradition, in that these are radical ways of thinking about human beings. And I think to actually see that struggle, you know, and the tensions that it evokes, you know, really impresses upon us how fortunate we were to have these two geniuses. And I think you can also see how the zeitgeist of early 20th century Vienna shaped their thinking.
And Zurich.
Because sometimes when you read Freudian theory now, it can seem very remote, and you kind of think, really? Is that the case?
Yeah.
Is this valid? But actually, when you see it in the context of the place where it was developed, and I think this comes through especially with the female characters in the film, I think you really gain a much deeper appreciation of where Freud and Jung are both coming from. So, you know, they are similar in many ways. They, you know, they do share lots of commonalities. So, for example, I mean, they were both born into very modest family circumstances. So Freud was the son of a wool merchant. Jung was actually the son of a very poor pastor. in Switzerland. They both studied medicine before moving on to psychiatry or psychology. But they both acknowledged just how important the unconscious mind is in human psychology.
Sure.
So they have this fundamental basis for being drawn together. But as we see in the film, there are quite a number of differences and tensions that emerge. And I think it is, it's very striking to see, they're both geniuses in their own right, but actually very different in many ways.
Oh, absolutely. They are two sides of a coin, in my view.
Absolutely, yes. So, I mean, with Freud, you have the kind of old established theoretician that he was. And then you have, the up and coming Jung who's making his name. Obviously, Freud was Austrian and Jewish, and Jung was Swiss and from a Christian background.
Right.
You've got Freud as a really faithful family man, actually. And I think we see that most clearly in the film when Jung visits Freud in Bergasse, and he has dinner with the family. And there's this quite amusing shot of, the whole family gathered around the dinner table looking very expectantly.
Well, because
the visitor.
Jung was taking all the food. They're like,
absolutely,
oh, crap, I'm not going to get any.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you contrast that, with the sort of lavish house that Freud's very affluent wife is able to provide him with.
Absolutely.
And of course, Jung is a philanderer. I mean, he's kind of, he loves Emma, but it doesn't prevent him forming relationships with Sabine Spielrein and then later on Toni Wolff. And then you get Freud being quite dogged by ill health. So we see him collapse at the conference, which actually did happen in real life. That is not created for dramatic effect. It did happen. And Jung did come to his assistance in that.
Yep.
And then you see Jung, quite healthful and energetic.
He does live a lot longer.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and Freud was, as we know, I mean, he was a cocaine addict, and he was also, addicted to his cigars, which actually killed him in the end through oral cancer. So, but I think we see the juxtaposition most clearly in the scene when they're boarding the ship to travel to the States, when we see how Jung kind of says, well, I'm going this way into the first class area provided for by his wife. And Freud is obviously not able to do that. You also get the juxtaposition of their views on the paranormal, which I think comes through very clearly in their discussions. So Freud has no interest in the occult, whereas Jung is absolutely drawn by paranormal phenomena. And again, in the film, we have that incident of where there's the sound from the bookcase that Jung anticipates, and he knows it's going to happen, and it does happen. And again, that is a real life event that did happen, but they didn't speak about it after it had occurred. But this fits really closely with Jung's views in that he was very drawn to the spiritual, to the occult, to the idea of symbols and totems, which comes through in his theory of the collective unconscious. And the thing that always strikes me in the film is that at first, when I saw the film for the first time and I heard Freud say that they had to defend their science, and he deliberately calls it a science.
Mm-hmm. Don't you see, we have to stay within the most rigorously scientific confines. You all right?
Yes, but I can't agree with you. Why should we draw some arbitrary line and rule out whole areas of investigation?
Precisely because the world is full of enemies, looking for any way they can to discredit us. And the moment they see us abandon the firm ground of sexual theory to wallow in the black mud of superstition, they will pounce. As far as I'm concerned, even to raise these subjects is professional suicide.
I knew that was going to happen.
What?
I felt something like that was going to happen. I had a kind of burning in my stomach.
What are you talking about? It's the heating. The wood in the bookcase just cracked, that's all.
No, it's what's known as a catalytic exteriorization phenomenon.
A what?
A catalytic exteriorization phenomenon.
Don't be ridiculous.
My diaphragm started to glow red hot.
It's late.
And another thing. It's going to happen again.
What?
In a minute, it's going to happen again.
My dear young friend, this is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. You must promise...
You see?
That's just... You really can't be serious.
There are so many mysteries. So much further to go.
Please, we can't be too careful. We can't afford to wander into these speculative areas. Telepathy, singing bookcases, fairies at the bottom of the garden. It won't do.
And when I've taught, the paradigms in psychology, I've kind of contrasted behaviorism, which, is based on inductive method and being able to observe and measure things from the outside and being a very scientific approach,
right. Yep.
Contrasted that with the psychodynamic paradigm, which seems to be anything but scientific. So, you cannot see the unconscious mind. You cannot see the id, ego, or superego. Mm-hmm. We just have to, believe that they exist.
Right.
But the more I've read up on this, I think the scriptwriters did an excellent job in that Freud was apparently under attack by the Nazis at the time in Austria, who dismissed his work as pseudoscience. I think his use of the word science is the attempt to have his work taken seriously and not have it derided in the way that it was, because he was Jewish.
Right.
So I think, at first I kind of prickled a little bit when I heard that, thinking, oh gosh, what are these directors doing? Do they not understand the paradigm? But actually, I see it for the time at which it was. It was done. It needed to be said. It needed to be presented as science.
And Freud has mentioned many times that that's what he thought he was doing with his. What he was doing with psychoanalysis at the time, that it was scientific and it was all based in medicine, and they were going to unlock the various issues that, of course, mostly women were having. And but he was also off his rocker. I will state at the top here that I am no fan of neither Freud nor Jung, and
right, okay,
so
it's allowed.
Yes, because and all due deference to their contributions to psychology. They've made some great contributions to psychology, but they also did considerable damage to psychology that still is being fixed now, and still some of it is just wild and out there. I've been on the record for disliking the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Now, that's not necessarily Jung's fault, but he did meet with Catherine Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers, and essentially signed off on what they were doing. He had some disagreements about how they were using his theory, but he still just was like, all right, that's fine. It's whatever. I mean, he was toward the end of his life at this point. So I don't think he had much fight left in him. But the MBTI does continue to do damage to psychology as a science, as represented to other groups, other lay groups that don't necessarily know what personality theory is. But specifically back to the movie here, because I kind of want to dive into the portrayal of psychoanalysis, this being essentially a psychoanalysis themed movie with the concepts and the characters representing a little bit of the broad idea that Freud had created with the id, ego, and superego, as you were saying. So let's talk about how psychoanalysis was portrayed in this movie. So the audience member here can get a sense of what they're in for when viewing this through a psychological, historical, or historical psychological lens. What are some of the aspects of psychoanalysis that you spotted?
Well, I think it helps if you understand a few basic principles before you actually watch the film. So,
that's a good idea.
So if you just have a basic concept of the id as being all your unconscious desires and everything that appeals to your basic instincts, it kind of wants pleasure and it wants it now. It's that kind of a drive, which I think we can all feel within us. I'm sure we're all able to sense that in our personalities. And then that's sort of counterbalanced by your superego, which is your sense of right and wrong, your moral conscious. It's the thing that holds you back from just indulging all the appetites that you have. And then in the middle, we have poor old ego who tries to keep some kind of balance between these two very basic forces kind of pulling us one way and pulling us the other way. And I think you can see this in the actual characters in the film. So if we think about Jung's wife, Emma, so I think she's played exceptionally well by Sarah Gaydon in the film. She is almost a symbol of the superego. So she is the perfect wife. She's the mother of Jung's numerous children. She lives in this perfect home. She is able to finance the whole of his research with her.
I know, it's wild.
Yeah, all his work is financed by her. And then we have Sabine Spielrein, who is the symbol of the id, really, in that she basically wants to have a relationship with Jung and is determined to get it. She's not going to be taking no for an answer.
And just to cut in there for 1 second, the film starts abruptly with Sabina being sent to the hospital that that Jung is working at as a young doctor, and he wants to attempt the talking cure, which is what it's referred to in the movie, which is just honestly talk therapy, which we call psychotherapy these days. But it was new, and that's what a dangerous method in the stage play. It's a most dangerous method was the name of the book, The Talking Cure was the name of the play. Sabina is going to this hospital because she is suffering from fits of hysteria.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Jung. I admitted you yesterday.
I'm not mad, you know.
Let me explain what I have in mind. I propose that we meet here, most days, to talk for an hour or two.
Talk?
Yes, just talk. See if we can identify what's troubling you. So as to distract you as little as possible, I'm going to sit there. Behind you. I'm going to ask you to try not to turn around and look at me under any circumstances. Have you any idea what may have brought on these attacks you suffer from?
Humiliation and any kind of humiliation. Like, I can't bear to see it. It makes me feel nauseated. I start pouring with sweat, cold sweat. My father lost his temper all the time. He was always angry with me.
When you stopped talking just now, did a thought come into your head?
I don't know.
Or an image, perhaps? Was it an image?
Yes.
What was the image?
It was a hand. My father's hand.
Why do you think you saw that?
Whenever he hit us, afterwards we had to kiss his hand.
My thought is, that case I was writing up last week, I happened to pick the code name, Sabina.
And we later learn that the hysteria and the tics that she shows at the beginning here are all based in what the Freudian theory of psychoanalysis would expect. She was abused by her father when she was younger. That's what we learn. I don't think that secret is necessarily a spoiler, so you learn it very early into the movie.
Yeah, you do. You do.
And so I think we pivot away from her being a patient very quickly. She tells her deepest, darkest secret. Jung and Freudian theory would suggest that that's because she was beaten and she has attributed the sexual desires to that thing. You can still hear some very prominent people talk that way these days. I don't think that it's as clean as that, but in the case of the movie, that's how they explain it. So that's why I think Sabina is set up as the id. And then in the next part, I think you'll mention that Jung is the ego, correct?
Absolutely, yeah, because he is sort of trying to balance his life between these two driving forces.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got kind of lust and passion on one side with Sabina, and then responsibility and his duty as a father and the loving husband on the other. So I think that is this whole sort of triangular relationship perfectly conveys this tension within the psychoanalytic theory itself.
Absolutely.
And in fact, the way Sabina is portrayed in the film is incredibly accurate to what we know of her, actually. So she did have a track record of becoming infatuated with people. She was incredibly intelligent, but, had fantasies about having a child with various people who she was infatuated with, which she does with Jung.
And stated as such in the movie as well, yeah.
Yeah. The one thing that I would take issue with the filmmakers on is that Sabina's diaries kind of make us think that she may not have had a full sexual relationship with Jung, in that she describes their relationship in her diary as poetry.
Interesting.
And, we wonder, it's a kind of, well, it's something that we will never know, isn't it? But it's not 100% certain from a historical point of view that they did have a sexual relationship on that level. They certainly did have, this fierce attraction and intimacy with each other.
Gotcha.
But she describes it as poetry, and that she wants more of the poetry is how she describes it.
Yeah.
And also, I think in the portrayal of Emma Jung, like we're describing her as the superego figure, and as this sort of perfect wife who, sort of has this beautiful house and is completely devoted to her husband. Again, in real life, she was not quite as weak as I think the film portrays her. So she took an active interest in Jung's work, and she actually discussed with Freud the latent tensions in his relationship with her husband that she was picking up on. So she was an incredibly perceptive woman. Certainly not the kind of, weak, subservient wife that I think the film tends to portray Emma as.
And I just want to add to that because one aspect of psychoanalysis that I really appreciate, or just psychological measurement in general, was the scene where Emma is assisting Carl with his free association task, which is a big part of it, right? And so she has her hands. I'm just going to describe this to you, listener, because I think it's a really cool contraption. And Sabina helps Jung with the recording of it while he is administering it. So Emma has her hands on some copper plates, which are attached to some kind of capacitor or something like that, some kind of current collector. I don't know. And he puts weights on her hands, and so that's going to be measuring the galvanic skin response. So it's a circuit, right, of copper plates, and so the more that there's sweat, the more electrolytes there are, the more current is going to pass through to this drum that has a light that moves back and forth, or a light is shown on a mirror. Excuse me, light is shown on a mirror. So this mirror is moving back and forth in relation to the current that's traveling through the circuit, and it moves the mirror back and forth, and a light is shown on this mirror at an angle, and the light then reflects down onto this like clear ruler, and it's a slit. It's really cool. It's a slit, and then another person essentially moves a counterweight back and forth, trying to match where this light is. And then that counterweight moves a needle and scratches a black parchment paper, and that gives you the voltage change in the person's hands. And I think it's an amazing contraption.
It is. I mean, I think this film really shows you just how psychology used to be in its infancy. When you think of the sophisticated techniques that we're used to these days, rewind 100 years, and this is what psychology was. Yeah.
Computers do everything that like 4-piece or 5-piece contraption did.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it just shows how far we've come, really, doesn't it?
It doesn't. And like you said, about 100 years, 110 years or something like that.
110 years we're talking. Yeah. Now, the other character that we've not mentioned so far, but he is really important to how psychoanalytic theory is portrayed in the movie, is Otto Gross. Now, he is a kind of maverick psychoanalyst. I think that's the best way to describe him. I mean, he's basically an anarchist.
Yes, I 100% agree. And the interesting thing about Gross in the movie is that he is the one who does cocaine.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, basically, I think he is portrayed as having this kind of fragility. So, I mean, he's basically a hedonist. He lives for pleasure. He believes that you should indulge all your appetites fully and without any guilt. And he is the kind of catalyst to Jung going into his relationship with Sabine Spielrein, kind of, full tilt. Well, once he's kind of listened to Otto Gross's pronouncements on the importance of pleasure. But I think he also has this, he is a maverick, but I don't know, he has a kind of almost genius quality about him as well. He's like the sort of flawed genius. So he is, an addict to, I think, it could be sort of latent schizophrenic tendencies that he shows in the film. He's definitely got anarchist tendencies.
Very id tendencies,
Yeah, he's fragile, but he has that kind of, the genius quality about him. So I think he is an intriguing character. But the way he talks about indulging your appetites without any guilt or reticence about it, he is the embodiment of id. So basically, just enjoy your freedom from society's norms. Do whatever you want, and what gives you pleasure is his philosophy. We have sort of Freud is the superego in this tripartite relationship. So he is very firmly against the relationship between the psychoanalyst and the patient becoming overly cozy, shall we say. So he's very much for having a rigid, unwavering theoretical model and having a very clear boundary in relationships between the psychoanalyst and the client. And this is where part of the tension with Jung and his relationship with Sabina starts to founder, because Freud says he can't think about Jung in the same way once he receives a letter from Sabina describing her relationship with Jung. But in this sort of triangle, we have Otto Gross as the id, we have Freud as the superego, and then Jung is the kind of ego trying to satisfy its desires of kind of helping clients from their miseries, but then also acknowledging, the theoretical model that Freud has developed and his father figure status within the psychoanalytic movement. So I think this is the sort of richness of the film. It gives you so much to think about that you can see it on so many different levels. I think it's symbolic, but it's also a really heartfelt portrayal of the the tensions and the feelings and heightened emotions that were obviously experienced by the characters at the time. So that's why I particularly enjoy this as a historical film, but it also can be seen in this symbolic way as well.
I agree. And I think the final piece of psychoanalysis that is embedded throughout this, and then we'll take a quick break, is the incredible amounts of dream interpretation that happen throughout the movie. There is so much dream interpretation.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is. Yeah.
And it is perhaps the most common behind, discussions of relationships in this movie is the common conversation that is happening within the dialogue.
I dreamed about a horse being hoisted by cables to a considerable height. Suddenly a cable breaks and the horse is dashed to the ground. But it's not hurt. It leaps up and gallops away, impeded only by a heavy log which it's obliged to drag along the ground. Then a rider on a small horse appears in front of it so that it's forced to slow down, and a carriage appears in front of the small horse so that our horse is compelled to slow down even more.
I imagine the horse is yourself.
Yes.
Your ambition has been frustrated in some way.
The rider slowing me down.
Yes.
I think this may refer to my wife's first pregnancy. I had to give up an opportunity to go to America because of it.
Ah.
The carriage in front perhaps alludes to an apprehension that our 2 daughters and other children, perhaps still to come, will impede my progress even more.
As a father of 6, I can vouch for that. Not to mention the inevitable financial difficulties.
No. Fortunately, my wife is extremely wealthy.
Oh. Yes. That is fortunate. This log.
Yes.
I think perhaps you should entertain the possibility that it represents the penis.
Yes. In which case, what may be at issue is that a certain sexual constraint has been brought about by a fear of a succession of endless pregnancies.
I'm bound to say that if one of my patients had brought me this dream, I might have said that the number of restraining elements surrounding this unfortunate horse could perhaps point to the determined suppression of some unruly sexual desire.
And it's a great way to move dialogue along in this kind of movie because it's just 2 people talking to each other on the screen, and it's very static, and that's all you're looking at. But it's a very good way to move a conversation along and have these really big intellectual conversations that are embedded in something that everyone does and everyone can sort of get behind that, and that's the idea of dreams. And of course, it is a staple of Freudian theory and Freudian thinking that your dreams represent some kind of subconscious issue that you're dealing with, but instead of being direct, because the subconscious is obtuse, shall we say, obfuscated, that it has to come in the form of symbols, and you have to interpret those symbols because we are not, as lay individuals, not trained or ready to decipher, and so we need the help of a guide. And very interesting conversations that occur. My favorite one probably has to be where Jung is talking to Freud about having a large log in one of his dreams, and Freud just interjects at one point and says, the log could represent a penis, and it's the one thing that is not danced around in the movie, right? Because a lot of the discussion of psychoanalysis in the movie is dancing around how much sex is discussed within the theory.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I mean, I think at one point they actually make fun of Freud.
Yes, they do.
I don't know if you remember this scene, but somebody says, how come it's all about sex with Freud? And then, Jung kind of says very wryly, well, I think it's because he doesn't get any, and everybody finds, it's a sort of, little wry dig at Freud.
But I think this particular line that Freud gives, that Freud throws, is the screenplay writer going, yes, penises are a are a staple of this, right? It's all about penis envy and all of that. So everything's a penis. And I again, the joke, the derision that is directed at Jung, or excuse me, at Freud at the other scene that you just referenced. I think this particular one is like, yes, all right, it's a log connected to a penis, and let's get it over with. And so I thought it was really fun to explore dreams in that way. There is a lot of it. Again, it is moving the conversations along, moving the dialogue along, moving the tension along, as well as Jung wants to bring in more supernatural explanations, and Freud is like, just stick with what I've developed already. And that tension growing, because as the dreams get weirder and weirder, or more symbolic and more symbolic, you see them start to separate on how to best interpret the dreams as the main way to reach the subconscious. So I want to take a quick break, and we will come back to asking some additional questions about this movie. So stick around with me and Dr. Sheila Thomas. Are you a big fan of the Cinema Psych podcast? A connoisseur of the compelling stories and intriguing insights that we have on this show? Well, show your love in style with our premium podcast merchandise. Yeah, that's right. I've updated the podcast store, from ultra comfy hoodies perfect for cozy podcast binges to sleek coffee mugs that add a dash of personality to your morning routine. Our merchandise store has it all. I've added so many new products, and it's designed to withstand countless listening marathons. There are a lot of episodes. I think you'll love them. But wait, there is more. Every week, there is a new promotion, turning up the volume on value. So keep an eye out for our exciting special promotions. Every other week, 15% off. In between, sometimes there's a special 25% off day. And then sometimes there's free shipping. It's the perfect way to score your Cinema Psych podcast merch for less. I'm excited to have expanded the merchandise offerings, but I'm really excited to say that new designs are coming up. And you can put these designs on all of the merchandise. So keep an eye out for new arrivals in the design section. So don't just listen, wear it, flaunt it, live it. Visit our merchandise store at cinemapsychpod.swanpsych.com/store to shop your love for the Cinema Psych podcast today. Remember, every purchase goes directly to supporting this show. And of course, thanks for listening to this show. I love doing it. Now let's get back into it. And we are back with Dr. Sheila Thomas discussing A Dangerous Method, a fictionalized take on the relationship not only between Freud and Jung. You psychology folks out there should know those names just by their last ones. And a woman named Sabine Spielrein who gets in their in the middle of them, in their way. We'll see. I've got a couple more questions for Sheila here. And we're going to start with this question that she came up with, and I think it's a great one to get her thoughts on, which is, what can we learn about the history of psychology from this film? I think it's a an important question to ask, because this is a great film to use in a class like history and systems or just history of psychology. So, Sheila, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, I think from the very first scene, I think we're quite horrified, really, by how Sabine Spielrein, who is clearly suffering, a very high level of emotional distress, is restrained. We see the hospital building of the Burg Holzli sort of looming at the top of a hill in a really sort of unfriendly, threatening manner. When she's admitted, we have these formal nurses in uniform. The treatment involves things like the immersion in cold water baths. We have moved so far from this model of treatment that I think it's actually very salutary for us to look back and think, gosh, that is what treatment used to be.
Absolutely.
Just over a century ago. Look how far we have come from that. This is why psychology is so important.
Yeah.
And research is so important. I also think if we look at the female characters in the film, I think you can see how psychology was completely male dominated.
Oh, yeah.
So at the conference, if you remember that scene, they're all basically middle-class, middle-aged men. Sabine Spielrein is the only woman in a man's world. And, she was a hugely, hugely accomplished woman.
Yes.
But she is surrounded by men in this completely male-dominated discipline. But I think most importantly, what this film shows us is within the history of psychology, I think we really need to give full credit to Freud for breaking the mold. We see just, how intense the struggle was for him to get his ideas accepted. If you read his various biographies, he would dearly love to have been awarded the Nobel Prize, which he never was.
In medicine?
In medicine or psychology, but he was friends with Einstein, who of course famously was, but he never had that accolade. He had to fight against so many attacks from other intellectuals. He was under attack politically as well, in the very turbulent time in which he was living. All sorts of pressures were on him as a Jewish person living in Vienna, which he stubbornly refused to leave. He may have been a giant in psychology, but politically, he was incredibly naive. He thought that sort of the rise of Nazism was some sort of, local dispute that would be resolved very swiftly. He really had to battle on so many fronts. So I think, we need to really acknowledge the efforts that had to go into having psychoanalysis accepted by the mainstream. Also, from a historical perspective, we were just talking about the symbolism of the penis, weren't we, not so long ago in our podcast? I think you only need to look at the lives that the female characters live to realize that penis envy was actually typically in Freud's case, typically conveyed with sexual overtones.
Right.
But actually, you can see how the symbolic meaning of that is that, women in that society were envious of men, but not for the, the actual organ itself, but for the status, the power, the wealth that men clearly had. And even, accomplished women like Sabine Spielrein, like Emma Jung, were trailblazers, trying their best to forge ahead, but in a very male-dominated society. And if you look at Freud's wife, she was an expert in running the family and the home. But she was very limited in what she could do. And that was exactly how, Freud makes no secret of the fact that, he regards women as having weaker superegos than men, because the female cannot fear castration in the Electra complex in the same way that a boy can in the Oedipus complex.
Yeah.
So the gender bias that is hugely prevalent in that society. I think we need to see it in its historical context, but realize how fortunate we are to have moved on from that way of thinking.
So I want to push back a little bit on your description here. So, and I'm going to use a source that I give my history of psych students to when we talk about Freud. So there was a book that came out a few years ago. 2017, by Frederick Cruz, Freud, The Making of an Illusion. And so I want to pull back a little bit here and suggest that even though we do have psychoanalysis, and you like that or you don't, it has some benefits for some disorders out there, not for everything. And so Cruz pushes back on this deifying of this, or canonizing of this figure in psychology, and uses basically his own words against him as far as science is concerned here. And I think this is very useful for the question that we have posed here in this show, which is, what's the historical significance of this film? And I think using this film and showing Freud as a super ego type figure, right? That is a foil for the character of Jung. Pushing back on the actual man himself, I think, is very important here as a counterpoint. So these were the words that he said of himself toward the middle end of his career. He said this, quote, "I am actually not at all a man of science. Not an observer, not an experimenter, not a thinker. I am by temperament nothing but a conquistador, an adventurer, if you want it translated, with all the curiosity, daring, and tenacity characteristic of a man of this sort." I think that's a fairly bad analogy to have made, knowing what we already knew at the start of the 20th century, that being conquistadors in all of the nations that eventually gained their own independence in the 1800s from Spain, probably not the best analogy to make. Essentially saying that he wants to conquer psychology, or at least the ideas of psychology, in my own mind, and not of the kind of person that he is portrayed in the film. I think it's really critical to draw that separation from a historical perspective. He once told a friend, "We do analysis for two reasons: to understand the unconscious and to make a living. We certainly cannot help the patients," end quote. He's a
Well,
bit. He was, and I think a lot of it had to do with being a cocaine addict. I mean, it's entirely possible that he had significant problems with his own mental health, and he was using cocaine, and he advocated it for it. Like he would tell patients, have you tried cocaine? Because it helps me. So maybe it'll help you too. He also did a lot of morphine. So, I mean, yeah, we could say that psychoanalysis is an interesting idea. It helped bring about other interesting ideas. But also, some of the things that Freud did were not great. He was not a very good human being. I'm happy that he was able to escape Nazism, especially in Austria, because Austria was like, yeah, exactly, Hitler, whatever you say, and became a part of Germany. And so it was a good idea for him to have left. And I'm glad for that because of his Jewish ancestry, but he was not a very good psychologist at all.
Right. Can I beg to differ?
Absolutely.
Right. So I think you need to give him real credit for having these completely original ideas that no one else had before.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with that statement.
Yeah. And I think I mentioned earlier that he actually saw himself as being on a sort of continuum with Darwin.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
So, on someone...
that was probably the cocaine.
Perhaps it was. Perhaps it was. But I think this is, the whole relationship with Jung is kind of Freud seeing Jung as being his heir apparent.
Yeah, exactly.
Very much at the beginning of the relationship. Mm-hmm. He is immensely proud of his work, wants it to be taken seriously, and especially as well. I mean, in his own daughter Anna. I mean, the way that
stuff.
The father-daughter relationship worked was exceptionally close. I mean, I can kind of see where he was coming from with the kind of Oedipus and Electra complexes with some of his own family relationships. But and actually with his own mother, apparently his own mother called him, mein goldener Ziggy. He was the cherished firstborn son, and cosseted by his own mother. So, we can see, where some of these theories have their roots.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I do think that his originality, his trailblazing theories, okay, we know they have their flaws. We know that we cannot prove any of it scientifically, but, I can't prove it's right. Equally, I cannot prove that it's wrong. You either accept it as it stands or you don't. But I think that the fundamental principles that Freud introduced, okay, he has this enormous emphasis on sexuality. So if you think about the libido, so Freud sees this as definitely sexual drive, whereas Jung sees it more as a kind of life force, and things like the unconscious mind. Freud's original idea, it's a unitary unconscious mind. Jung wants to take it further and subdivide it. So I think you have to give Freud credit for having had the originality that caused these ideas to be brought forward. And, this is how progress works, isn't it? We take other people's work, we revisit it,
right.
We modify it, we do further research, and this is how we move forward. But the huge leap forward that he makes from, basic behaviorism into something that we kind of recognize as psychology today, we wouldn't have had, the humanistics or, cognitive approaches.
Right.
Those wouldn't really exist without Freud opening the door to those paradigms. So,
Yes.
I mean, he, all the neo-Freudians, I mean, we've been talking about his fallout with Jung. It wasn't just Jung that he fell out with. He seemed to have a track record of falling out with lots of the neo-Freudians
yes.
on various, technicalities or points of practice,
Yeah.
This was not uncharacteristic for him to fall out with his fellow theoreticians. But I do think he is a sort of gateway figure. And he opened the door for us to be able to see other possibilities. So personally, I know he's very, very easy to criticize. We can really knock him down. I also think we need to remember the positive side, that actually we wouldn't have any of the other later paradigms without Freud opening that very important door for us, over 100 years ago now. It's we've come a long way really since these ideas were first put forward.
Yeah, I agree. So very briefly here, who do you think would enjoy watching this film just in general?
So in general, I mean, I think anybody with an interest in psychology, but also in just, culture generally. This is powerful social history that I think anybody would enjoy, actually. So you don't have to agree with the psychoanalytic theories in order to appreciate where Freud's ideas are coming from. So,
or where Jung got his ideas.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can see how Freud lays the foundations that Jung then builds upon. So I think anybody who's interested in popular culture, obviously, I mean, my IB and my A-level students absolutely adored this film.
Mm-hmm.
They thought it was incredibly powerful, and it brought to life the psychodynamic paradigm for them. Before we watched the film, it was just kind of very theoretical. This really brought it to life for them.
I agree. Absolutely.
And also, I mean, talking about popular culture, did you know that David Bowie, for example, was heavily influenced by Jung? So especially the animus anima archetype, so the male in the female in the male, and the persona archetype was, very a favorite of his. He actually name checks Jung in Aladdin Sane. So listen out when you're next listening to the album. Jung also appears on the cover of Sgt. Pepper.
Oh, yes.
So
as one
if
of
you
the
know the
faces.
famous album, the Beatles' very famous film cover, he is one of the faces there.
Excellent.
I mean, Freud, as sort of, his concepts have just passed into mainstream popular culture, haven't they?
Yeah,
So, I mean, we talk about Oedipus and electrocomplexes,
Freudian
we talk about
slips.
Dream interpretations, Freudian slips, So these two, as I called them right at the beginning, these two giants of psychology, I think everybody should get something from this film and gain that, gain the understanding of seeing them in their historical context. And I personally think that the film has paid a tremendous tribute to their endeavors. It was not an easy ride for either of them. And the film does stick remarkably closely to the historical and diary evidence which we have in enormous detail.
Yeah, Cronenberg says that everything that happens in the movie in a public setting is more or less historically accurate, and then the things that happen in the privacy of rooms is speculative. And that's I think a great way to approach a character-driven stage play-esque nonfiction basis for a story. I mean, again, it's not going to appeal to everyone. It's an indie art house film by David Cronenberg, which is quite different from his body horror stuff. But it offers, and this is my evaluation, to add to yours of, I think it's appropriate for pretty much all audiences because it's only 90 minutes and only a little bit longer with credits. So it's like it's really snappy. You don't see too many dramas that are only 90 minutes, and scenes move very quickly. A lot of really heavy intellectual, brainy topics that if you blink, you might miss a word or two that makes a whole lot more sense. It's still very, the dialogue captures you for each of these small little vignettes. I think is very helpful, snappy, as I said, and you don't even realize that it's 90 minutes later and you're like, holy crap. And then there are these naughty scenes with partial nudity in them where it's just like, where it gets your heart rate going a little bit more and you're like, oh, my attention shifted. Okay, great. Now I can do another brainy scene between Jung and Freud again. So I think it's a really useful film, as far as you said at the beginning of our conversation, Sheila, where you said, it's a very important piece of art that can help, and the images themselves can help with student understanding and things like that. And it doesn't bore you to death. It does not bore you to death. And I think that's really important in this kind of, in this setting of using films in one's pedagogy.
Absolutely. And I think it's also just beautifully shot.
Oh, yes.
Some of the scenes are just wonderful just to look at the artistry of the shot. So, for example, in Jung's boat, when the boat is approaching the jetty, the music works so well with it. You get some fantastic shots of Vienna. It's just a beautiful film that offers you so much on so many levels. So I think it is for the specialist student. They can, really get to grips with the sort of theory that they've covered. But it is also for a more general audience, and it's part of our heritage, really, that we should be aware of, and how it still influences popular culture today. That's what I think you can really get from this.
I want to thank Dr. Sheila Thomas for joining me to discuss a dangerous method. Before we say goodbye, Sheila, is there anything that you'd like to plug? Where can folks find more about your work? This is for you to reach out there. What do you got?
Okay. Well, it's been an absolute delight to discuss the film with you, Alex. Thank you so much for inviting me onto the podcast.
Absolutely.
If anybody would like to look me up on LinkedIn, you can see my profile there. As I say, I am a researcher and teacher, and I've written a book of practice questions for research methods at A-level, which you can get on Amazon, you can get on troubadour.co.uk. And I do a lot of online tutoring. So I live in quite a small village in Portugal, but it is remarkable what technology makes possible. So if you would like to contact me, my email is Sheila Thomas, all one word, lowercase, 7905 at AOL.com.
Excellent.
And I do get excellent results, by the way.
Yes, you got to put the plug in for, the outcomes. Absolutely. Well,
Yep.
Thank you. Perfect. I will link your LinkedIn and I will link your email address in the show notes. Thanks again, Sheila, for joining me to talk the movie.
Great. Well, I hope the audience have found it interesting and enjoyable.
I think so. That's going to do it for this episode. Until the next one, thanks for listening.